at the end of 4.1, we saw Laruelle move on to a critique of the notion of field of individuals that would function as a hinterworld, a sort of metaphysical behind the scenes. And in terms of that critique, he criticized other associated notions such as body, continent, epoch, episteme, and I suggested that paradigm goes in that set. So we have a seeming paradox where first, in this last paragraph of 4.1, he talks about his new paradigm that opens a field of realities that have been absolutely hidden. And then he goes on to reject the notion of field with the proviso that rejection is of field as a hidden hinterworld. So at this point, this ambivalence in the notion of field is almost the same as Deleuze's ambivalence with the notion of a thought, the image of thought. His critique of the image of thought and the new alternative is expressed sometimes as thought without image and sometimes as a new image of thought. So here will be the new thought for Laruelle will be a thought without an episteme, without a paradigm, without a field, or a thought with a new type of paradigm, unary instead of unitary, and a new type of field, as we shall see, transcendental directly and not a hinterworld. So in 4.2, he goes on to give more detail to this critique of the notion of field and of the unitary paradigm that opens and discusses or describes or explores this field. So the problem from Laruelle's point of view is that such a paradigm and such a field, so let's call it a unitary field, are necessarily combinations of immanence and transcendence. So here, this idea of the field serves as one way of going further in his analysis of the circles that characterize philosophy. From this point of view, the space or field is called unitary because it is made of the circularity of these two dimensions, that is to say, immanence and transcendence. So the circularity now is seen as a reflective circulation between immanence and transcendence, and minoritarian or individual thought is the experience of these entities, that is to say the individuals or the minorities, that do not fall under the scope of the unitary field. So they're not determinable in a unitary manner. They are already determined through themselves, so directly, and not through the mediation of the unitary paradigm, and not through the mediation of transcendence related to immanence, as we saw, however slight the transcendence, it's always too much, because it binds the immanence into a reflexive circle. Finite individuals are real entities before they are magically captured by the unitary field. So this idea of a pre-existent, in a transcendental sense of pre, not chronologically pre-existent, of a pre-existent transcendental field of individuals or minorities, leads us to see the unitary field as one of magical capture. So by implication, it's one of magical thinking. So we're finding, aside from the power aspect of magic as imposing one's will on the universe, there's this, or trying to impose, there's this contrast between scientific thinking and magical thinking. This rejection of all transcendence and of the circulation between immanence and transcendence and of the unitary field, which has not just reflexivity but symmetry, I would say a weighted symmetry, not a necessarily equiponderated symmetry, but a symmetry and reversibility between the two dimensions of immanence and transcendence. So here Laruelle makes a qualification in terms of the relation or the disanalogy with quantum physics, which is a little strange given that later in Philosophy 5, quantum physics will be used as an example of non-reversible or irreversible thinking, given that the formalism is based on non-commutativity. So he says that maybe, perhaps, here the comparison with quantum reality ends. So he's talking about quantum reality and not quantum thinking. So maybe there's a hint that quantum reality, as normally understood, contains at least a partial element or aspect or dimension of transcendence. And yeah, that's something that we'll have to see as his thought evolves. So unitary reality, which we call effectivity, thus ought to be rethought according to the individual or minoritarian real. From the first parameter to the second, there is no longer unitary relativity reciprocity, but a strict asymmetry and irreversibility, or an order, in sharp contrast to the more or less decentered circles to which aporetic philosophizing is accustomed. So whether it's dogmatic, apodictic, systematic philosophy or deconstructionist philosophy, all philosophy contains a deconstructive element, and all deconstruction contains a metaphysical element from Laruelle's point of view, and it's all aporetic because it's circular. The aporia or impasse implies that we back up and we continue circulating to try and find another exit, and everywhere we go we're going to find impasses, and that we're still stuck in this aporetic, reflexive, symmetric, reversible circle of immanence and transcendence. So that means that philosophy is relativist in the bad Greek sense, or Greek sophistic and empiricist sense of the word. But true relativity is based in an absolute and unsurpassable finite experience of individuals as finite. So the criterion here, the criterion of demarcation between non-circular, what he's going to call non-philosophy or non-circular scientific thought of man or of humans, and circular philosophical thought is experience. So he's going to go on to analyze that notion or the concept of experience in the third paragraph. But first, in between, in the second paragraph, he has a little consideration on the micro level. So as an inadequate, because compromise figure. So he seems to be thinking perhaps of Deleuze, and Deleuze and Guattari in particular in 1,000 Plateaus. But as far as I'm concerned, the differences that he sets up are more or less the same as the differences that Deleuze and Guattari set up. So Laruelle considers that in order to get away from the macroscopic world of objects, the microscopic world, whether it be in terms of minorities, as opposed to the authorities of the macroscopic world, if we consider that the minorities are micro-political, micro-psychological, micro-sociological, micro-sexual, the micro is always molecular and not a true particulate. So it's in continuity, is more or less the same as the quantitative, qualitative, or intensive scale of the macro. So we've got the macro, the micro, which is only relative, and so relativist in the philosophical sense of relativity, and the real level of the field outside the macro level is this particulate level, which is what Deleuze and Guattari say in 1,000 Plateaus. The molecular level is an ambivalent compromise level, and it is still not a stage of full deterritorialization. So there they are in agreement. So we need to get to not the micro level, but to the particulate level, which is the level, if it's or the field is perhaps a better term, the unary field, which Deleuze would call the totally deterritorialized field, but Laruelle will have none of that terminology. So the unary field is particulate, that is to say it's composed of objects that are individuals, minorities, pure subjects. We describe here the immediate givens of the invisible, because the regimes of visibility are defined by the macro level and the micro level. They're just different types of and regimes of visibility. But the so that's where empirical experience resides. But the invisible is the field of the individuals, pure individuals, pure minorities. So the invisible is what is seen in the one. So the invisible is not absolutely invisible. It's visible in a different way when we take up the point of view or the posture of the one. At the same time, now that Laruelle has given us a new form of experience, seeing from the one, a new form of vision, so a new form of givens that would be both the concretization and the validation of his non-philosophical thinking. We get a new criterion behind that. To know whether it's experience or not, we apply the criterion of the one. So seen in the one is pure, non-empirical, that is to say transcendental experience. Seen in the macro and micro levels, seen in being, seen disconnected from the one, is where you find empirical experience. So, in a sense, he's setting up the ordinary human as a visionary. The ordinary human sees in the one what is not observable from the point of view of the regimes of visibility, what is not visible from the point of view of the regimes of visibility. So it's not empirical seeing, it's vision. Objectivation thus can no longer serve to experimentally verify essentially transcendental theorems, whose only pertinent criterion, so we're back to the criterion again, is the unreflective immanence of the one that serves as their common thread. So the unreflective immanence of the one is it's unreflective, so it's not circular, it's not caught up in the circles of philosophy, and as we saw in this subsection, that one way of defining these circles is in terms of symmetry, reversibility, and circulation between transcendence and immanence. We've got immanence totally unrelated to all transcendence. So it's an unreflective, that is non-circular, immanence, that is to say pure immanence, of the one, that is to say individuals outside of their possible or attempted definition and capture by the magical thinking of philosophy and the human sciences. And that's the common thread. Another way of describing it is the descriptive fidelity to the real. That was one of the 5 traits or characteristics of the science of ordinary man. So it's naive, not reflexive, so unreflective. It's real, so there it was opposed to hypothetical. It's descriptive. This is the term that comes up here. Unreflective, descriptive fidelity to the real. And it's human rather than anthropological. That's where the scene from the one comes in. The one is the human as opposed to the anthropological. Laruelle then goes on to talk about principles in his sense, and then to carry on rather his critique of principles in the sense of Greco-Unitarian thought. So he says, understood correctly, these principles will perhaps allow us to denounce the so-called legitimacy of a question someone unable to resist objecting will not fail to pose. Here we come to something which I find is ambivalent. Well, I'm ambivalent to it, of ambiguous value in Laruelle. He's always talking about how he replies to objections, and he's got a long experience of the same objections coming up over and over again. Perhaps that's true. Perhaps he was fed up with stupid, boring, repetitive objections from people who have no idea of what he's on about, who cannot see the leap he's made into a new paradigm. But I would argue that that's an empirical consideration, if it's that. If it's just empirically, in his experience, the objections are all wrong, and one wonders why they would all be wrong. Why he can't say most objections are wrong. But anyhow, all objections are wrong, and he's elevating that empirical experience into a transcendental principle. These objections will not fail to be posed. That is to say, he's capable of predicting what the objections will be, and no matter how they're expressed, no matter how they vary from one case to another, they're all wrong. That's what he's going to call later as being based on the principle of sufficiency, which is another way of describing the closed circle of philosophy. But at the same time that he does that, he's globalizing and predicting, and so immunizing himself against criticism. So one wonders where the scientificity is in that operation, and sufficiency is this idea of my thought is complete, my circle is complete, and the corresponding in French sufficiency means being enough, being adequate, and it also means being pretentious, being smug, self-satisfied. One could even say stuck up. So here there's an aspect of sufficiency in Laruelle's complaint, that it's the same old objections that inevitably are posed. And he's saying that his principles will perhaps, he puts a perhaps in, allow us to denounce the so-called legitimacy of the question that can be brought up here. And the question is, show us your minorities, give us examples or cases, stop talking about them abstractly. So here he's refusing the legitimacy of this question. So he's refusing, as we said in the first couple of videos, he's refusing to give examples or cases, and he's, at least in the eyes of the critics, he's talking abstractly. And we said that's part of his method, that you have to talk abstractly because, as his analysis of the givens that are contaminated by the unitary paradigm, if you directly give examples and cases, they will be contaminated by the old paradigm. So they will very often, I don't think it's necessarily the case, but they will very often count against you and seem to invalidate your point of view when, in fact, they have been constituted as part of the self-validating circle of the old paradigm, in this case, the unitary paradigm, but the same applies to scientific paradigms. So he's totally within what I would call reasonable principles of method and heuristics to, at least for a long time, refuse to give cases and examples. And I put in this reservation, at least for a long time, because it takes time to build up new observations, new cases, new examples, as seen, as he would say, seen from the one. So you have to reform the observers, if that's the right word in this case, to be visionaries and not observers in the old sense of unitary observers. You need pluralist visionaries instead of unitary observers before the new cases, or the old cases, because they were already there, before cases and examples and givens and experience can be adduced. So he's right to refuse the trap. At the same time, I don't think he can denounce absolutely the legitimacy of the question. Sometime or other, we're going to need examples, cases, that is to say, concrete engagements with the real, and not just sort of general high level abstractions that are, from Laruelle's point of view, direct descriptions of the real, because they're not in that circular process of self-validation. This saying, we refuse legitimacy, should really be not now, later. And then the question will come up of how much later. And Laruelle goes on for quite a long time with this is the beginning of a whole cycle, if I may use the word cycle, which connotes circularity, of a whole cycle of research where the examples are consistently, the demand for examples is consistently denied any legitimacy. So for me, there is the question of the time limit. Yes, defer the moment when you present examples and cases to the moment when we are capable of seeing them from the new paradigm, but you cannot defer indefinitely. There may be no particular lapse of time, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, maybe. This book was published in 1985, so that's 36 years ago. Is that long enough? Do we find examples later on in Laruelle's work? Or, and that could be an interesting question, because we do find examples to a certain extent. Do we get to these examples, however refined and sophisticated their presentation, do we actually get Laruelle giving examples because he has modified his thought to a certain extent? So if that is the case, if that were to be the case, that would mean that despite being quite a reasonable response to say, no, it's illegitimate to ask me for cases and examples, there are two possible uses of two possible treatments of this this response. One treatment would be circular, and as I said last time, we have to be constantly on the lookout for possible circularity in Laruelle, given that he's saying that he's breaking away from all circularity. And we have the benefit of hindsight, because we have the benefit of everything that he has written and published over the intervening 36 years. So if we had tried to make our objection on the spot at that time, maybe we would have been convinced, or at least set aback by his response. But 36 years later, we are are permitted, even if we just limit ourselves to Laruelle's work, without talking about other people that I argue are doing non-standard philosophy, like Badiou, Zizek, and Bruno Latour, and no doubt plenty of others at the present time. So I feel this paragraph is both quite reasonable and quite questionable. He goes on to say, these questions have become so obvious to us that the response they receive here will seem rather casual. Okay, if everybody, all the time, even the most intelligent people who've read your stuff and listened to you, are making the same sort of response, asking the same sort of question, there may be a point there where you say, stop, I'm not listening, it's obvious, I can predict that you're going to say that, it's not legitimate. It may be a case that non-philosophy should be opening your ears as it's opening the field, and you don't have to sort of bow down to every sort of argument that comes along. But once again, this is both true. Whenever a new idea, a new point of view, a new theory, a new paradigm comes along, there are always lots of people who can claim, and they may even have cases and examples and arguments on their side, and they can claim that they are able to refute this new idea. And Laruelle is right to say, no, don't give me the obvious arguments against my point of view. Give me something non-obvious. Or, I would add, treat the obvious in a new way by elaborating your own alternative paradigm. This essay is written to show that this sort of question has no bearing on a rigorous conception of the essence of minorities or individuals. In other words, that its relevance is only politico-logical, anthropological, that it has its possibility in polito-logical difference, which is the matrix of Greco-Occidental or unitary thought. Well, I would say Laruelle should be so lucky that everybody who criticizes him is speaking out of the Greco-Occidental unitary thought. As I remarked in the earlier videos, when Laruelle comes to call into question Greco-Occidental difference, virtually everybody important around him had already called it into question too, in favor of a multiplicity or a multiple that is not related to or codified by difference. So if he thinks all those people are at that moment repeating Greco-Occidental difference, I think that he's overgeneralizing. And today, 36 years later, if Laruellians make the same response, they're even more guilty of an overgeneralization that is not adequate to the current situation. It goes on to talk about the problem that these sorts of objection turn the problematic of minorities, he is using problematic in a favorable sense, they turn minorities into some sort of stake, whether it's theoretical stakes or political stakes, and so they are not being approached or seen um, from themselves, but only sort of instrumentalized in terms of various actual or possible stakes. So what he calls for, and I think this is important, is this sort of question that we were talking about must now be abandoned in order to reach a problematic of minorities and a science of man that would itself be minoritarian. So I think this is an important formulation of what the leap is and why the new paradigm is not really a paradigm. So it's unary and not unitary. Because as long as you have a paradigm about multiplicities, or multiples, your paradigm itself will not be, or need not be, or may not be multiple. So that's the leap from thinking about the multiple in the old style of thought that was constructed to think in terms of the primacy of unity, and so all multiples will be subsumed by that type of thought under unities, and a type of thought that is not just about the multiple, but that is itself multiple or minoritarian, so that is not configured in a way to cheat, to weigh the dice or whatever. It's the minoritarian thought of minorities must itself be minoritarian, and that's the leap. And you see that in other philosophers, although Laruelle doesn't want to talk about them and probably wouldn't accept it. But you see the difference when Deleuze gives up the thought of difference that he developed in difference and repetition, and in logic of sense, difference drops out. And that's, as Deleuze himself admits, a transitional work. And what he's seeking to do is to have a multiple thought of multiplicities, and that's the next step, and that's what happens when he starts his collaboration with Guattari. A similar point can be found in Bruno Latour's work, and he even does a series of degrees of ontological pluralism, and one degree is monistic, although it doesn't see itself as that, but a monistic talking about pluralities that we see in actor network theory, and the higher degree of ontological multiplicity, where the multiplicity is in the theorizing itself, is to be seen in his inquiry into modes of existence, at least according to Latour. So this sort of step we can see being taken in several thinkers, and it's a crucial step. From this proceeds a thought without examples, but not without precedents. So this thought without examples, or thought without cases, is very like the Deleuzian notion of thought without image. There are no examples or cases of minorities described in this way. They are certainly the object of an experience. So we come back to the idea that, yes, there are examples and cases of minorities, and these minorities are the object of experience. That is to say, are the object of vision from the one, and not vision in terms of existing predicates and categories, which are ultimately ideological. So it's an experience that is strictly transcendental and no longer empirical. So that's a tough one to see, and I'm not sure if at this stage we can elucidate it any further. I would say we've already seen it at work if we validate or subscribe to Laruelle's critique of these questioners that are trying to reabsorb him back into the old paradigm. Empirically, he may be able to say he keeps on coming up against the same objections. Transcendentally, he can see that these same objections, whether their form is the same or radically different in each case, he can see that behind, if that's the right word, these questions, or generating them, is the circle of philosophy and reflexivity. So the empirical experience is the actual objection given. The transcendental experience is seeing the philosophical circle that is giving rise once again to this new variant, or the same old thing, or this new variant of the objection. So that will be a case of a transcendental experience that is not, something separate, that Laruelle goes around having empirical experiences, and then he goes back home, locks himself in his study, and he can have all sorts of transcendental experiences all by himself. They're the same experiences, but not seen in the same way. So, playing on the words, we could say not experienced in the same way. So he goes on, one of the big negative words in this book is the word of stake. He absolutely, he says it at the top of page 19, he says it again at the bottom of page 19, that minorities are not the stake of any politico-logical, anthropological agon, that there's no minority question, because as soon as you raise the minority question, you're no longer inside the minority as purely self-determined, and you're subordinating it to something else, a stake, and so you're instrumentalizing it as well. So what you're doing is defining the essence of individual multiplicities in such a way, this is on page 20, as to exclude any figuration whatsoever. So it's thought without an image, defining minorities as to be without an image, without a figuration, and so without a schematization in terms of examples and cases. As though passing from a macroscopic or even molecular sphere to a particulate sphere, where laws would be entirely different from the figurative laws of the first. The one is the criterion. So back again to this notion of criterion. And so he's putting really a lot of weight, a lot of philosophical weight, a lot of noetic weight on this idea of the one. The one is the criterion that enables a leap from the enclosure of representation once and for all, and the abandonment of the aporetic knowledge of philosophy in order to establish a necessary science of man. Okay, I would like to differ from the translation on this point, that enables a leap. In the French, it says, là est le critère qui fait sauter définitivement la clôture de la représentation. Okay, fait sauter, it has sauter, which usually means leap, but faire sauter is to make explode, to explode something. So, in fact, it's not just enabling us, the one as a criterion, it's not just enabling us to leap from the enclosure of representation. That's what he's already said several times. The one is the criterion that explodes the enclosure of representation once and for all. So it's not just that we leap into a new paradigm. It is that the old paradigm, in virtue of that leap made by some, is by that very fact deprecated and rendered impossible to use, even if it's like the death of God, and it will take time before news of this explosion of the enclosure of representation reaches most of us. We will not believe that because of this refusal of all empirico-ideal experience. Minorities are a concept without reality. So the experience that he's putting forward is not empirico-ideal. That is to say, it's not empirical experience in the ordinary sense, which is already idealized in terms of the immanent transcendent circles of philosophy and of its avatars. So if we refuse that sort of empirical experience and the cases and examples, we will not believe that minorities, in Laruelle's sense, are a concept without reality, the object of only nominal definitions. We've been talking about this from the beginning, from the forward to the book. You do have a series of nominal definitions, but Laruelle is setting things up for them to be real definitions as well. If it's just nominal, it's sort of like a pure mathematical game of terminology, and ultimately it will be a circle, a self-validating circle, or if it was badly done, it will be a self-refuting circle. They are true immediate givens, real essences lived in pre-political, pre-linguistic, etc. experiences. So these minorities are given in experience. It's just not empirical experience as that is ordinarily understood. But it's not a theoretical experience alone. It is a theoretical experience, and we ourselves are pure theory, nothing but theory, absolute theory, we could say. But it's real experience. Their necessity, provided we stand by it, is shown to be the necessity of an ultimate and absolute requisite for the existence of authorities themselves. So this proviso of their necessity, provided we stand by it, you have here a notion of fidelity, which is necessary. You can't just throw up ideas, a new paradigm, and then go on to something else and say to others or to yourself, I'm just playing, I'm just speculating in the playful sense of speculation. You need the fidelity because you need the duration, the time for the semantical trickle-down effect to come to reconstituting your basic experiential categories and operations, so that you can come to a new understanding of experience consonant with the new paradigm. So that's the fidelity. The fidelity is the time aspect. So we have to persist. The fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise, says William Blake. So the transcendental fool, that is the ordinary human within the new paradigm, must persist in that folly, even if he or she cannot give immediate examples that the established consensus would admit to be or acknowledge to be examples that confirm their case. So the necessity of these givens, of these essences, is shown to be the necessity of an ultimate and absolute requisite for the existence of authorities themselves, and the necessity of the effects their conception produces on the state, but although the exploration of these effects confirms the reality of finite individuals, it does not demonstrate it. This essence of minority is positive, concrete, and open to a rigorous transcendental description. Okay, there we get the idea that there are two modes of demonstration of the existence of these essences, of this essence of minority. One is that rightly conceived, the existence of authorities is only possible because there are these pre-authoritarian minorities, that authority itself would never exist, or only nominally, if there were not these pre-existent essences or experiences. But that's the indirect path of demonstration. The direct path is this, well, Laruelle makes a distinction. This is not this indirect path is not really one of demonstration, it's one of confirmation. So in a sense, we're confirming something indirectly, but we're not developing that thing, so in terms of something else, that thing in its own terms. So that's the direct confirmation, which is also a demonstration. This essence of minority is positive, concrete, and open to a rigorous transcendental description, which involves notions whose content and organization are articulable and definable. So what is outside all these categories and predicates, outside all of Greco-unitary thought? It's not just some sort of blob. There's this outside blob, and you can't. It's ineffable, and you can't say anything about it. It's inarticulable, and you yourself are inarticulate when you want to refer to it. You're just sort of in a posture of negative theology. Everything that can be said must be diffused, deprecated, deconstructed, because it's not it. In fact, this essence of minority has a description in terms of notions whose content and organization are articulable and definable, just not in terms of the old paradigm, the unitary paradigm. So this is a promissory note that we are going to get to articulations and definitions, and these definitions are not going to be purely nominal as in an abstract game, but are going to be real definitions that will comport a dimension of experience that belongs to us, or is accessible to us, or is something that is available to us in terms of a new type of vision, a vision in the one, as opposed to the ordinary, well, the consensual, empirical vision we have had up to now. So we're still in the introduction. So at this point, he's promising articulation and real definition, and that's something to keep in mind as we read through the rest of the book. Is that degree of articulation enough? Is that degree of definition enough? Has Laruelle succeeded in this book fully or partially, and to what extent?